Afternoon. My name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I am participating in this webinar from Ottawa, located on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As an organization, we recognize that there are many steps on the road to reconciliation that this is a journey we must all take together. This is particularly true when we think about land use and agriculture's role as a major user of Canadian and traditional land. Today's webinar is the first of a special two-part series exploring land use in agriculture in Canada. How we use our limited land base, keeping in mind only about 7% of Canada's land mass is used for agriculture, is core to the success or failure of Canadian agriculture. The pressures on land use continue to increase as farmers, three levels of government, conservation groups, Indigenous groups, and more look to balance the economic, environment, and social aspects of sustainability. That is why CAPI launched the Policies for Land Use, Agriculture, and Nature, or PLAN initiative, to better understand these pressures that agricultural land is under and explore new solutions. The first webinar will look at some of these issues, including the financial aspects of ag land, the dynamics around the adoption of soil conservation practices, and explore the influence that crop insurance has on land use and how farming is done. The second webinar later this week will look more closely at biodiversity and conservation dynamics. Featuring insights from recently published research by two of our doctoral fellows and a distinguished fellow, this session will provide valuable perspectives on safeguarding Canada's agricultural future. You will hear three perspectives followed by a dialogue between our three panelists. You can find the reports that they have released on CAPI's website on our PLAN hub. PLAN aims to advance solutions that enable us to feed the world sustainably, protect farmland, preserve nature and biodiversity, and promote food security. This initiative is supported in part by the RBC Foundation through RBC Tech for Nature. We value their support enormously and appreciate them enabling us to undertake this important work. Now, before we hear from our panelists this morning, we'd like to hear from you, our audience members. We've got a poll that we will share on the screen, and we would encourage you to take a couple of minutes to fill that poll out. We would like to hear your thoughts around whether or not we're doing a good job connecting land use issues to those broader sets of dynamics. So we'll just give a minute for the poll to come up. So our question today is, does the Canadian ag policy landscape connect the economic, environmental, and social aspects of agricultural land use? We ask you to choose between yes, no, or sort of, but not well enough. So if you take a minute to fill that out, we would appreciate your participation. I'd also like to take the time now to highlight that recently, CAPI released a report looking at digital agriculture. We see a lot of potential for Canada to do more from a digital agriculture perspective, and we are pleased to work with Emily and have the support of TELUS as well as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for the report. And we look forward to doing more because we see tremendous potential for Canada to go further on digital agriculture over the next decade. So if everybody has taken some time to participate in the poll, we'll share the results and then get underway with our discussion this morning. So 67% of the people have said that we are sort of connecting economic, environmental, and social aspects of agricultural land use, but we're not doing a good enough job of it. So we look forward to diving into that today. And we're going to do that with our first panelist this afternoon. That is our distinguished fellow, Courtney Anderson. Courtney is a CAPI Distinguished Fellow and owner of Courtney C. Anderson Professional Corp., a consulting firm he owns and operates to provide consulting services to farmers, agribusinesses, and general business owners. He holds the role of farm advisor for succession planning with Farm Life Financial and lead consultant with the law firm Sicut-Guilbeault. His deep agricultural roots include growing up on a family cow-calf farm, a career spent in agribusiness, and a Bachelor of Science in Ag Economics from the University of Guelph. Courtney, thank you very much for doing your work. Can you start us off today by sharing some of the themes of your research, key conclusions, and recommendations you have?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, thank you, Tyler. I'd like just a special thanks to yourself, Margaret, and the team at CAPI, and also Steve Duff from OMAFA for your numerous edits, reviews, and discussions on the data. There's a lot to unpack here. It's an exciting topic when I look at it. So for the purpose, I guess, of this paper and this research, it comes from the acknowledgement that actively used farmland in Canada is decreasing, and there is a need to address this. So understanding better the economics of farmland use is a key component of advancing evidence-based policy solutions. So for this paper, we really drilled it down to 3 or 4 key objectives. The first was to suggest an approach to measure farm returns, farmland values, and farmland rental rates across Canada, the provinces and regions over time, using publicly available data. Then we wanted to take that data, analyze it, and look at the relationship between the various components for the same geographical regions, and then look at an analysis of the degree to which farmland rental rates reflect economic rents at the farm level, and if this reflects cap rates and discount rates for farmland. And of course, with the information, we wanted to then come up with some recommendations from a policy perspective and some considerations for making policy going forward. So we came up with 5 or 6 key takeaways. First, I have to say that the Census of Agriculture, it's an incredible tool. It provides valuable data to provide sectoral analysis on farmland values, rental rates, and profitability that I'd suggest is not well understood by most in the sector. The data provided by the census can be updated and compared regularly and reviewed at all levels. And consider that a bit of a plug for the census. The information there, just to drill down and be able to work with it, is phenomenal. So in terms of looking at some of the data, one of our first observations was as net operating incomes across Canada have risen in the last decade, farmland rental rates have caught up to farmland value appreciation in most of the areas across the country. And we think this reflects the strong demand for productive farmland and a rising understanding of its underlying profitability. The second point is that provinces and regions with highest population density have the lowest capitalization rates, and there's no surprises there. Ontario and BC in particular, given their population. And conversely, on the other side, provinces and regions with the lowest population density have the highest capitalization rates. And that likely reflects the limited alternative uses for farmlands in these regions. The third point was that appreciation in the value of farmland alone is not enough to offer an all-in discount rate of return for the typical investor. And this is despite the large appreciation in value of farmland in almost all regions across the country, really speaking to the need that policy needs to align to ensure sufficient motivation or return for farming agricultural land. The fourth point was that farmland rental and farming itself offer a strong potential additional return on investment to owning farmland, but come at considerable risk and uncertainty. In the investment space, I guess you'd say past performance is not indicative of future results. So there's certainly a danger of looking at known average historical returns and ensuring that you does not offer the same perspective as looking at the future uncertain individual returns and the difference this could have on farmland use and ownership. The last point, on average farmland rental rates, and this was pretty neat. Farmland rental rates represent almost 90% of average net operating income per acre. So if you flip that on the other side, there's only 10% of the income available to cover all the other costs of production for a farmer that's operating on that land. The differences between provinces are large and clearly reflect other factors such as population density, access to markets, and processing capacities, differences in farm type, size, land quality, and zoning. So I guess that comes down to then some recommendations from a high level that maybe we can take this information to assisting in coming up with policy. So first, farmland, and there were 4 or 5 recommendations here. Farmland is under significant pressure from urbanization, and consideration should be made for ensuring all agricultural lands are consistently in production. The second would be various regions across the country have adopted policies with restrictions around land ownership to minimize the reduction of this farmland. The effectiveness and potential application of these policies to other regions may prove useful. So doing some additional work, maybe drilling down to a county level and being able to create some policy and see how policy that's being used right now, the effectiveness of it would be useful. Third would be, given the competition for farmland, understanding what future generations of farms require to invest in farming, and where possible, renting of farmland in an economically viable manner to encourage growth has value. That just comes down to succession planning, and the next generation wants to come in, and we really don't want to burden them with an undue debt load. The fourth one would be analysis of this data, again, down to the county level, and even by farm type and farm sales would be beneficial to further support evidence-based economic policy. And lastly, and again, this just goes back to the census, is that we've got to continue to keep and encourage the collection of the agriculture information in the census. And that's the summary, Tyler.
Great. Thank you, Courtney, for that. Just briefly before we go to our next panelist, you touched on this earlier, but I think it's important to highlight that farmland use in Canada is going down. I think that's often something that people don't appreciate. And I'm wondering if you would just comment on the difference between urban expansion versus vacant farmland that we see across the country.
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act, right? There's priorities and pressure from urbanization, and often those are more short-term pressures in terms of we need more housing. It's easiest just to go outwards versus upwards, but unfortunately, those are it's pretty hard to reverse that. It's pretty hard to undo asphalt pavement and go back and create more farmland. So we've got a scarcity. We certainly can, in some areas of the country, go a little bit further up north as climate changes and take advantage of some of that to put more land in production. But it is difficult to replace that, I'll say, typically great farm agricultural land on the outskirts of cities, in particular. Well, BC, Ontario are 2 prime examples.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, we'll get into this more once we bring the other panelists again. Thank you for kicking things off. I would like to bring in now our second panelist today. That is Ghislaine Soussou, a CAPI Doctoral Fellow and a PhD candidate at Laval University. She holds a master's in mathematics, economics, and statistics from the African School of Economics, and a bachelor's in statistics and econometrics from the University of Abani, Calavi in Benin. Prior to her PhD, she spent 6 years evaluating development programs across West Africa. Her work focuses on the economic impact of soil conservation practices in terms of cost effectiveness, adoption, and impact on land productivity. Her research interests include data modeling and applied econometrics. Ghislaine, can you start by sharing some of the themes of your research, conclusions, and recommendations that have come out of your doctoral fellow paper?
Good morning, everyone. My research focuses on the impact of soil conservation practices adoption on land allocation. This study investigates what drives vegetable farmers to adopt soil conservation practices and how these choices affect crop selection and land allocation in Canada. And this study has 3 specific objectives. First, the objective evaluate the factors that influence the adoption of soil conservation practices in Canada. The second objective examine whether adoption of soil conservation and selection of vegetable crops are simultaneous or sequential decisions. And the third objective assesses whether adoption of soil conservation practices influences vegetable crops acreage allocation. And there are three main findings. First, the key determinant of soil conservation practices include access to customer operators, access to market, monetary value of land and building on the farm, use of family labor, writing a succession plan, and having environmental farm plan. Second, there is interdependency between soil conservation practices. There are some practices like cover crop and multi-cropping that are complementary. And this complementarity provides several benefits to the ecosystem. Conversely, practices like minimum tillage and multiple cropping act as substitutes. And this suggests that farmers face constraints when adopting both practices simultaneously. My second finding highlights that adoption of soil conservation and land use is in terms of decision process, adoption of soil conservation influence farmers' land use through two decision stages. At the first stage, farmers simultaneously adopt the practices and select the type of crop to cultivate. And at the second stage, farmers allocate land size depending on their vegetable crop specialization. And my main recommendation from this finding is that policy should account for farmer crop specialization and specific soil requirement of cultivated crops. And they should also design programs that balance environmental sustainability and economic sustainability. I thank all CAPI team to their support to derive the main policy recommendation from my research. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ghislaine, for that overview. I just wonder if you could go a little bit further in talking about some of those challenges that you saw in between the practices that are complementary and those that aren't. I think at times we think it can be very easy to do all of these things together and may lose sight of some of the practical challenges that exist as farmers are considering what practices to adopt. So can you speak to some of those practical challenges that you saw that came out in your work?
As challenges, there are many, but I can highlight three. First, the challenge related to the soil conservation practices is that the minimum tillage require management. The bad, I don't know how to say it in English, sorry. Les mauvaises herbes.
Yeah, weeds.
Weed management. So it's difficult to do minimum tillage and multiple cropping at the same land at the same time, on the same land at the same time. But the second challenge is related to the land use. Farmers with succession plan tend to allocate more land to high value crops. And this strategy can enhance profitability, economic profitability, but it can constrain soil environmental sustainability. It helps long-term family investment also, but the environmental sustainability is not guaranteed with this strategy. But farmers engaged in soil conservation tend to produce crops that better are linked with conservation goals. And this strategy constrains economic returns, but support long-term environmental sustainability.
Great. Thank you for that. We look forward to diving into some of these questions more. And but first, we'll bring in our third panelist today. That is another CAPI Doctoral Fellow. Andrew Berra is a CAPI Doctoral Fellow and PhD candidate at the University of Alberta, specializing in development economics. His research centers on misallocation and productivity, with a particular focus on understanding the roles of market failures, policy interventions, and climate change. His work leverages machine learning and advanced econometric techniques applied to remote sensing and large-scale survey data. Andrew holds a Master of Science in Economics from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, a Master of Science in Food and Resource Economics from the University of Bonn, and a Master of Science and a PhD degree in Economics from Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. Andrew, can you start now by sharing some of the themes of your research, conclusions that you drew, and recommendations for our audience?
Absolutely, Tyler. Thank you for having me. Basically, my research focused on the link between climate shocks, farm productivity, and crop insurance. So in this research, I specifically look at how climate shocks are affecting Canadian agricultural productivity by just reshaping or altering farmers' cropping strategy. So what I found is that under stable condition, meaning that in a condition where there is no climate shocks, farmers tend to specialize in a very few high-performing crops. However, when this extreme weather events hits, they diversify to reduce the downside risk. Of course, this approach helps reduce exposure to catastrophic loss, but it does come at a cost, meaning farmers that diversify due to this climate volatility tend to see a measurable decline in their overall productivity. So therefore, there is a clear trade-off between the risk reduction and the productivity side, which is the efficiency gain. So this is the major takeaways from my studies. And the second question I asked is how or what's the role of the crop insurance? So here is where crop insurance plays a crucial role. My analysis found that crop insurance plays a crucial stabilizing role, meaning that farmers with strong insurance coverage are more likely to maintain their existing profitable cropping patterns even after a severe weather shocks events. But this approach, the recent data shows that this approach is becoming financially unsustainable because the data shows that the insurance claims and the payouts have surged in recent years, especially since 2018. I think it's jumped from the 2 billion to I think 5.4 billion. This is total direct payments under this business risk management programs. So what should a policymaker do? So there are a couple of policy recommendations that are derived from my analysis. The first one is they need to strengthen the current business risk management, like delivering the insurance indemnity quickly after the claim is verified, or it might be scaling up coverage to match the existing underlying loss, or simplifying the application process. These are just non-financial way of improving current business risk management programs deliverability. And the second and the most important policy recommendation that is derived from my analysis is the policymaker also need to complement the current business risk management programs with the proactive and the resilience building strategy. So this may include promoting drought resistance crop varieties or encouraging climate smart practice. So this approach can reduce future claims and sustain productivity while easing long-term financial pressure. Yeah, Tyler, so this is, I think, the summary of my research.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And your research looking at land use and the connection to business risk management touches two of my favorite files in ag policy. And I'm curious, one of the things that you talk about in your report is how the lack of data prevents a meaningful analysis of the effectiveness of crop insurance tools. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit further on some of the data points that are missing and what you would like to be able to better do to understand how effective these risk management tools are.
So data limitation was a major challenge during this my research work. And for example, we didn't have access to this farm level insurance data. So we just used the provincial level payout rate as a proxy for insurance exposure. And the second, we also didn't have the direct measure of the productivity, such as yield. So what we did is we just used the revenue per hectare as a productivity measure, which includes non-crop income, but it still provides a good indicator of overall farm performance. So more granular data on individual cropping pattern, insurance uptake, and of course, the adaptive practice would allow us to better distinguish between proactive and reactive decision.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And Duna, I'll now bring Courtney and Ghislaine back in for a group discussion, and a reminder to those that are tuning in live, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask some questions from our panelists. But I'd like to start off with a group question, and Courtney, I'll go to you first on this. The three projects, the reports that were released that you can find on the CAPI website, all speak to questions around trade-offs and questions and challenges when it comes to land use. Courtney, do you want to talk about some of the trade-offs that you see in your report, and especially around this question of agricultural land as an investment opportunity, and how farmers should be thinking about that, and what that dynamic around trade-off means for the future of agricultural land use?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. So I guess I mean, we spoke a little bit about it already, but one of the biggest things is land is scarce. It's an extremely valuable resource, and you've got residential or commercial development looking at things from a short-term perspective, and you're, in handling the short-term need, you're foregoing your longer-term objective of having food security, and of course it's difficult to measure. So we can look very, very quickly on a short term and have tangible results, but it's hard to see, what 30 years, 40 years down the road, not having 100 acres or 1,000 acres of land will be. So I guess, another one of the things on the trade-off is, and maybe this speaks to the challenge with the data that Andu spoke to as well too, is we're not in really a perfect data situation where we're working with data 5 years old from the census. There are likely other areas where there is some information, but it's we're in trying to make effective policy based on the data that's there. Some of it's just relatively dated, and more centralized, robust sharing of information would be great.
Great, thank you. We're going to come back to data in a minute, but I want to stick with trade-offs. Ghislaine, do you want to talk more about some of the trade-offs you saw in the work that you did?
Yes, in my work, I saw that farmers tend to allocate their farmland to crop depending on the soil conservation practices, technical requirement. If, for instance, if I think a soil nutrient demanding crops, some practices require crop rotation. So if a farmers allocate more land to high demanding crops this year, they tend to allocate less land to this crop at the next year. And the demanding crop are mostly cash crops. So depending on the years, farmer can have an increasing economic return or decreasing economic return.
Right. And Andu, on the question of trade-offs, I think you touched at some of these same issues that Ghislaine just raised around specialization versus diversification. How do you see that playing out, and again, the role that crop insurance plays?
Yeah, so the central trade-off in my work is between risk reduction and productivity, meaning that risk reduction or diversification versus productivity. So my study shows that when farmers diversify in response to climate shocks rather than specialize in their most profitable crops, their average revenue per hectare drops. So this is because resources are reallocated to a crop in which the farmers may not have clear comparative advantage. So while this strategy reduces risk, it comes at the cost of lowering overall productivity. So policymakers need to navigate this tension by ensuring that insurance doesn't just compensate loss, but also encourage resilience. In other words, insurance should reward farmers who implement adaptive climate smart strategy that reduce probability of that future loss.
And Courtney, there's a good segue there to, again, to the work that you're doing, where you look at that need to maximize profitability per acre and what some of the numbers and capitalization rates tell us about farmland and rental values. But how do you see that question around specialization versus diversification and resilience impacting farm profitability and farm income at the end of the day?
Well, yeah, and even as you apply it to land rent and you look at the pressure of, you've got young farmers looking to take over, grow their operations, and I'll say the cost of renting the land and the pressures from outside investors, and the need to ensure that if they're taking on more land, that they're successful. For example, a dairy operator taking on another 100 acres from a cash crop, and it's typically the next generation doing that. Without the support of crop insurance, there's, that safety net below, there's significant risk for that individual on that. And especially when you look at that margin of only 10%, it's really only 10% room for error when 90% of your cost of production is based on your land rent, right? So you can imagine if you have a failure in a crop year, you're underwater pretty quick.
But then how do you think about, again, this trade-off then from a policy perspective around needing to make sure that farmers have the right risk management tools so that they're not underwater quick, but so that they're also balancing the need to adopt more sustainable or more resilient, more adapted farming practices to reduce the risk in the first place? And Courtney, I'll get you to answer that first, and then Ghislaine and Andu to get you in on this as well.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge from a diversification or a specialization again, in terms of going with what's tried and true in the area versus diversifying to not have, to use the overused term of all your eggs in one basket. But I think we need a combination from a policy perspective of encouragement to diversify, but also still have that safety net as risks are taken.
And so, Ghislaine, what do you see as the ways that you can offer that encouragement to adopt more resilient farming practices or more climate adapted farming practices? What are the things that governments could be doing to do that?
We encourage the adoption. The government first can look at farmers depending on their capacity, because large-scale farmers are more risk tolerant. They are apt to adopt more practices than small-scale farmers. For that, regarding this aspect, I can say that government for the small-scale farmers can incentivize programs that the support that can compensate investment at the first years and all the time horizon of adoption. But regarding the large-scale farmers, government can more provide extension services such that farmers who large-scale farmers who adopt these practices can also do the cash crop and not to lead to land degradation.
And Andu, again, kind of on the same thing about encouraging the right balance between diversification and specialization, but I also want to get into that question around the differences in farm sizes and the differences in tools and support that those farmers need. So if you want to touch on those two thoughts, that'd be great.
Yeah, the policy and the program need to acknowledge that large and small-scale farmers face very different realities. So large farmers typically have a better access to finance and insurance, and they also have new technology, and so therefore they can absorb the shocks more easily. But in contrast, small farmers often operate with tighter margin or limited buffers and less access to information or service, yet they are often more exposed to these climate or weather shocks. So to manage these differences, policy should differentiate, not uniform. For instance, small farmers may need to create cost sharing for insurance premium or simplified application procedure. Meanwhile, large farmers might benefit more from market-based instrument or incentive tied to performance. Like I previously mentioned that the policymakers should implement this performance-based approach. Like if we apply this to insurance case, so insurance should reward farmers who implement adaptive and climate smart strategies that reduce the future loss.
And I think one of the things that comes up in this, again, you touched about it in your remarks, but again, it's come up in Ghislaine and Courtney's remarks as well, is this need to rely on aggregate data. I think one of the things that we often hear about regional differences in Canadian agriculture, and I wonder at times if that comes at the expense of an understanding of the differences in farm size or farm shape, and whether some of that is driven by the fact that we have regional data. A lot of the data sets that we have are provincial, and it can be harder to get more disaggregated data sets. So, and do you see that some of that playing out then? Again, we talked a bit about data availability earlier, but do you think that you would see a different story if you could better separate small farms from large farms and the way that crop insurance works for them?
Yeah, of course. For example, if we're relying on this very aggregated data, we are just risking masking this important heterogeneity across farms. Farmers are inherently heterogeneous in their cropping capacity, attitude toward the risk, even their demographic characteristics. So these factors are quite relevant when we are modeling response to climate shocks and any policy interventions. So for instance, if we have farm level data, we could test whether response to these climate shocks is heterogeneous across farms with different sizes or other relevant factors. So yeah, without disaggregated data, I think we can't really tailor insight as precisely to support specific farm types or regions.
And Courtney, you see the difference between that aggregated data and what you see working with farm clients directly. I'm curious as to how much of a difference or similarity you see between what the statistics would tell you versus what you're seeing on farms that you're working with on a regular basis.
Yeah, so for one, there's the timing issue, which is part of a challenge, is having access to recent information. And then it's, I guess one of the common questions that I get from individual farmers is, am I successful? Like, am I, this is how my operation is running, but, I think I'm successful, and it comes down to what they define as success. And often it is looking to see, well, what are others in the industry doing, and what are the practices out there, and how can I take those practices and implement them on my operation, and that. So, knowledge of being able to take your information on an individual farm level and then being able to apply it and say, farms of this size in this area, yes, confidentiality, but it certainly would give a means of measuring how their progress is doing. Farm ownership, just like business ownership, can be incredibly lonely, and looking to see, how are you doing, and discussing with others, and using that data, I think, is invaluable. Yeah.
And one of the interesting challenges, Courtney, is that, and to all of the panelists, is that there is a tremendous amount of data that exists inside government in different places, that exists as a result of digital agriculture, that is collected by provincial crop insurance administrators, but we don't do a very good job of making that data talk to each other, and instead we rely on old census data rather than finding ways to better leverage the data that exists today. And I think that's something that if we want to get to better policy, we all should try and find better ways to solve. But Ghislaine, again, we've had this question come in again about the differentiation between a large farm and a small farm. So I want to stay on this again in this land use context and ask you to go a little bit further around some of these concrete examples of what you might expect to see in the difference between how a small farm is approaching soil conservation practice adoption versus how a large farm is doing it.
If I understand, you would like the difference between large-scale farmers and small-scale farmers in terms of adoption.
That's right, yes.
Okay, in terms of adoption, large-scale farmers are risk lovers. They have to take a risk to test a new practices. Conversely, small farmers are not ready to adopt every practices. There are some practices that are the cost investment is high. They need the government support to adopt these practices. But large-scale farmers are ready to do that. And also in terms of large farmers, if they adopt these practices that are cost investment, they are apt to do it on long time horizon. And small-scale farmers are not ready to adopt these practices on long time horizon without government support.
And do you think that we would have more impactful policies if we could better target one set of programs to those small farmers that need different supports and a different set of programs to larger scale farmers? Would that get us better outcomes at the end of the day?
I think that it depends on the local context. It depends also on the region. If I take, for instance, Quebec province for vegetable production, there are regions like Montérégie, there are large-scale farmers. In this region, government, it will not be efficient to target small-scale farmers in this region. But there are some regions where the vegetable production is not high. And in this region, government can target small-scale farmers.
Right. And that is, I think, one of the, again, when we think about regionality or differences, diversity and program design, it's not just a matter of one set of programs in Quebec and one in Saskatchewan. It's about how do we find the right way to match farmers with programs, even within a particular region. Andrew, did you look at diversity in the risk management suite and tools when you were looking at this, and whether or not there are any examples of where that diversity is reflected in program design?
I don't really look at that way because I don't have this very disaggregated data to see if there's any heterogeneities across the regions. But yeah, so there is no any specific analysis related to heterogeneity in terms of this diversification or versus specialization.
Okay.
I think,
Okay.
Tyler, it may be a future project because I do think with the census data, we can likely drill down to using farm sales, get down to a size level, and then hopefully a farm type as well. And again, it's a little bit dated, but analyzing it over time and providing a tool that people can access and then Andu and others use. I think there's some merits there. So I think some of that information is there, but it's by no means perfect.
Right. And so, Courtney, I want to shift to talking about, again, vacant land. We alluded to a bit earlier, and this goes a bit beyond kind of what your work originally looked at, but fits this kind of broader question, again, when you look at land values and profitability and land use. We do have this dynamic where we're farming fewer acres. About half of what the acres that we're not farming are because of urban expansion, but half of them are acres that were farmed and are no longer being farmed for whatever the reason is. Do you want to get into, Courtney, what you see as some of those reasons beyond urban expansion and what that might mean or tell us about the profitability of land use in some situations?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a great observation because I think it's a real challenge and I go back to, I guess, a trip last fall. I was heading up north in Ontario, and I was surprised at the amount of farmland that I will say past New Liskeard that, you might say is not certainly not prime agricultural land, but at one time had been farmed, and there's brush growing up on it and that. So, you're right. There are a variety of reasons why land is not in production. It could be developers having bought it and having no incentive to put into production. And it could be just retired farmers looking at it saying, listen, it's more of a hassle to rent this out. I don't need the money. Let it go. So then what do we do on the vacant land side? And, maybe and I'll put out as a suggestion, maybe we only have to look as far as what some of the municipalities have done around the need for housing and vacant properties attracting, for example, a higher tax rate. So if you've got a piece of farmland, it's not in production, you're either not declaring farm income, you're not getting rental income on it. Is there the question is a stick? What's the best approach, the honey or the stick, right? From that side. So, yeah, I think we need to look at, like, zoning alone is not enough to prevent or to keep agriculture land in production. It can prevent other uses of the land, but we'll have land sitting vacant. So I think there's a variety of policies that need to be focused to get that land in production, because it could sit there for, especially on urbanization, you could have land sitting there for 10 to 20 years, waiting to be part of an official plan, good agricultural land that's just not being used. And there's not really much incentive to do that, to use it.
And again, it's important to acknowledge that we don't really have I don't think a very good understanding of how much vacant land there is that's not being farmed for reasons beyond profitability or marginal concerns. But one of the questions, Courtney, that came in was whether or not there was analysis done on the profile of landowners who are renting out that farmland, retired farmers, land aggregators, speculative developers, and does this have an impact on renters or how they approach renting? And again, I wonder if that ties in a bit to the discussion about whether or not some of that land's being left vacant as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we didn't drill in this research paper, we didn't drill down to that level. But yeah, there would be no question that there would be some influence on that and influence the value. Well, and I'm going to say even look at a big development company obtaining a few $1,000s for renting land is not going to move the dial with them at all. So they're likely, this is more of a pain than it is an income generator for them. So they will look and just say the bigger purpose is development and leave land vacant, where you could potentially have, again, a younger farmer looking to expand, take on some more land, and it's there, but it's not accessible due to urbanization and that and other reasons. But yeah.
Right. And Andrew, do you have a sense as to, again, the role that some of these risk management tools can play? Again, we talk about supporting or trying to find that balance between specialization and diversification and productivity and profitability versus sustainability. But when we think about that next generation of farmers that Courtney just touched on, do you have thoughts around the role that these tools can play in helping more younger farmers get into farming and take some of the risk out of it?
Of course, they are still buffering farmers against this the unforeseen risk. But I mentioned before, this approach is becoming financially unsustainable because the data shows that the payout rates have surged in recent years. So I strongly believe that if we augment this current business risk management program with some proactive and resilience building strategy, I think it could be effective and financially sustainable at the same time. Like if we complement this agri-insurance program with like promoting drought resistance crop or encouraging climate smart practice. So these are the way how we can just augment or how we can improve the current business risk management programs while while reducing the long-term fiscal pressure. So yeah.
Great. And so I want to pick up on this theme of proactiveness in our last 10 minutes that we have. And Ghislaine, I want to go to you on this first, because your report talks about, again, some of these other proactive approaches governments can take to help support farmers. What are some of those proactive examples you think government should be taking to help give farmers the tools they need to make better, more informed decisions and take better approaches to adopting soil conservation practices?
The existing program in Canada take account incentive to encourage farmers, but these intense incentives are short-term. They are not long-term, and they are based mainly on environmental farm plan. It's what farmers plan to do on his land. But I think that government can take account other criteria, like One Health criteria that put together soil health, environmental sustainability, human health, and animal health. And also the incentive could be designed such that it compensates the investment cost at the first year, but it also take into account the loss all the time horizon of adoption.
And sorry, go ahead.
There are many programs like Environmental Farm Plan in different provinces. There are PRANVER that are cost share programs. But these programs varies on the time, depend on the farmer who apply. They are not targeted on crop specialization on large-scale farmers, small-scale farmers.
And so you think that there's this opportunity to better target those programs, but I also wonder if you think we could do a better job, better connecting those proactive programs that you talked about, especially for adopting new practices or taking up more risky ventures, and then crop insurance as a reactive tool. Is there a way that we could be better transitioning from the world of proactive programs to more effective risk management tools as farmers mature in their adoption of practices?
I think that farmers has a huge role in a program implementation, and I don't think that there is a monitoring of adoption quite there with the existing program. So the program could also take into account the adoption if is very adopted, is not just reporting on farm plan. We could have a team that monitor on the land, like extension services. That is one aspect to encourage better adoption. And also there is crop specialization, crop insurance, and that take into account climate shock. I think it's a packaging with many factors a government program could take into account.
Great, thank you. And Andrew, your thoughts on this kind of proactive approaches and maybe that, how do we fill that gap that Ghislaine talked about that exists today?
I think government, our policymakers should implement this performance-based incentives. For example, if we apply this this insurance case, so if we policymakers, should reward farmers who implement this proactive strategy, like for example, like premium discounts. So these are the way how we can just bundle these risk management programs versus this on-farm conservation practice. So if we reward farmers who implement this on-farm conservation practice, I think that's the effective way of bundling these two policies in a coherent matrix. I think there are well-established literature out there, and in other countries, this kind of approach has worked very well. So I think that's the area that the policymaker should focus for next coming years.
And do you think other countries do a better job innovating when it comes to risk management programs compared to Canada?
I think so, yes. For example, we mentioned United States. Yeah, there are a lot of policies that leverage both this insurance and the conservation practice. So they are rewarding farmers who implement this on-farm conservation practice. And there's the impact evaluation literature, and that shows that this kind of approach has worked very well. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. And Courtney, do you want to talk about kind of more of those proactive approaches and what you think that we could be doing a better job of when it comes to land use agriculture and these issues?
Yeah, I think when, natural, I'll say business conditions don't result in the risk taking, then there certainly is a role for incentives, and kind of gentle nudges and motivation. But we also want to be careful not to create I'll say a false business path where we get a farm that's built up that as soon as we pull back on support, it can't stand on its own. So, there's certain areas, and just very specifically or very granular, we look at right now as I see land being cleared, we see farms typically, they're able to burn the trees, and, we contribute to greenhouse emissions. If we were to provide incentives where instead we turn it into things like biochar, put it back into the soil, create more better soil structure, growing conditions going forward. But that costs, right? So the easiest approach is a match and up goes that pile of wood, versus if there's an incentive to encourage that, but the long-term sustainability of the land as a result of, for example, putting that biochar back in, does that make sense? So it's a cost benefit analysis, I think, on each approach. Yeah.
Great. And so I want to go around to give you each a chance to offer one key recommendation you would like people to take away from your reports. But before we do that, Andrew, a question to you from the audience that's looking at the inequities between BRM programming, between crop and livestock production. Again, you talked about diversification versus specialization, but do you think that the current suite disincentivizes crop and livestock integration?
For my search, I just only looked at the crop farmers, but there's a shift between the crop versus the livestock. That's the way of the diversification, but I didn't capture this kind of dynamics into my analysis. So yeah, when we talk about the diversification, it's also include, shifting from the crop to the livestock activities, but this kind of dynamics hasn't been captured in my analysis.
Okay, thank you. So Courtney, let's go to you first. Kind of one key takeaway for people to leave with today coming out of your report.
Success. I focus really highly on succession planning, and I kind of look at this, and regardless of land ownership, there needs to be incentives provided to ensure land is not vacant, and we give that next generation the opportunity to grow their farm operations and make use of that scarce resource. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Ghislaine, one recommendation you would like people to take away from your report?
My report, I can recommend government to target the agro-environmental program based on farmers' crop specialization, their asset income, and also the soil requirement for each type of crops.
Great.
And also to promote the adoption, government could balance environmental sustainability and economic sustainability in the design of the program to encourage all types of farmers.
Great. Thank you. And Andrew, your recommendation you'd like people to take away?
Yeah, okay. So my takeaway, the takeaway from my research is there's a clear trade-off between risk reduction and the productivity. So the policymaker should implement policy that can help balancing these two trade-offs. So that's the final recommendation.
Great. Thank you. So thank you to Courtney, to Ghislaine, and to Andrew for taking part in the webinar today. Again, please go to our CAPI website and find the reports where you can dive in deeper. Again, I think these takeaways at the end on the need to support that next generation and farm transfer, the need for targeted support, and that bigger question around balance, whether it's this base theme around economic or environmental sustainability, this question around specialization and diversification and risk. These are all really critical issues that we are going to continue to explore in the work that we do at CAPI. So thank you to our 3 panelists, and thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on Thursday for our next CAPI land use webinar. Have a great day.